Welcome to the Leading with Empathy podcast. My name is Daniel Murray, and my guest today is a kindred spirit if I've ever met one. Deborah Pascoe from the Phronesis Foundation is a fascinating person to have a conversation with. Like myself, Deb's had a really interesting development in terms of her career, from sitting in those big seats in large organisations and stepping her way through into the consulting and leadership development space. Deborah now helps many leaders through the challenges of how do you navigate through a volatile, uncertain, complex and ambiguous place. And we speak a lot about the challenges for leaders. We speak a lot about the impacts of empathy in people and data-driven decision making. It is a big episode, and I fear we could have spoken for another 5 hours and barely scratched the surface. So I hope you find this really fascinating. There's lots of gems in here from Deborah, and I think you'll really enjoy it. Please welcome to the podcast, the wonderful Deborah Pascoe. Hi, Deb. Great to see you. Love to be having this conversation on the podcast. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. First of all, just maybe introduce yourself and a bit about what you do.
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me on the podcast. I'm delighted to be here. So I have a consulting practice, which is called the Phronesis Foundation. And I have a bunch, or I call them a constellation of strategic collaborators that support me in the work that we do, which is primarily around leader and leadership development, strategy development, culture work, getting teams working better. So that's about it. Been doing that for nearly a few decades. Nearly 3 decades. And before that, I was a senior leader in a large multinational corporation. So I've done the hard yards in the corporate world, and now do my own thing and love it.
Wonderful. First question around Phronesis. What does it mean? Why? Where does it come from? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah. I was a director in a boutique consultancy before I set up Phronesis. And one of the values that they had that I upheld was practical creativity. And I wanted to put my values on my website. So I didn't feel like I could just, copy and paste that. So I was playing with some different words, and I thought practical wisdom. I like practical wisdom. And then someone put me onto a podcast called Phronesis. And phronesis is Greek for practical wisdom.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
So it's really around, and look, I think we might play in similar worlds in terms of helping leaders to develop. I guess a question from me: what are some of the challenges that you see leaders you're working with getting stuck on, and what are some of the things that are holding them back most commonly for you?
Yeah, well, the author Bob Keegan comes to mind, and his book In Over Their Heads. And I think leaders are grappling with a whole lot of stuff. A lot of my leadership development work is around helping leaders navigate complexity and, the VUCA acronym that's being thrown around of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we're not taught how to deal with VUCA conditions. And so given that the world has become even more complex than it was even 5 years ago, a lot of leaders I work with are really struggling with that complexity. And, part of that complexity, of course, comes from dealing with human beings. And, I know that, from what I've listened to your stuff, you talk about the complexity of human beings. And so my focus these days, and it's the focus of my PhD, which I'm about 6 months into, is helping build the skills for leaders around navigating these tough conditions. I don't think we need to know any more or develop any more leadership concepts, models, or theories. I think we've got enough. I think what I want to help leaders do is practice the skills required. And skill, by its very definition, means practice. And, when we think of skilled tennis players or musicians, they don't get to a point of mastery. We never say that we're a master of this particular thing. It's about virtuosity, which is daily practice of building these skills. And, developing collaborative relationships and empathy, of course, is part of that. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of crossovers in the work that you do and the work that I do.
Yeah, Deb, I'm interested because I think there's part of me is thinking that we are living in a world where there's more complexity than there ever was before, and that's undoubtedly true. And yet we've still got the same old heads on our shoulders. But what I guess about the complexity is causing the bigger problems, because as you said, I think this is a really wise thing that we don't need more models, we don't need more frameworks necessarily, um, but it's actually which ones do I use when that I think is sort of part of the challenge. Is that what you're seeing? Because we've got an unwavering sort of stampede of increased complexity coming, and we're going to have to try and navigate through that. What are some of the, I guess, challenges with choosing when to pull the right lever or make the right move?
Oh, you've said so much in that short space of time because, well, first of all, I think leadership is essentially about self-awareness. And why do you want self-awareness as a leader? Not to necessarily understand the relationship you had with your parents, but self-awareness is the only thing that will lead to behavioral flexibility, which is understanding, given the person or persons and the context, what behavior is going to get us collectively a better outcome more often. And so, a key skill for leaders is being able to diagnose the context. So, before you even decide what particular style or behavior you're going to embody as a leader, and this changes, minute to minute, you need to diagnose the situation. And, I love one of the things that you said in one of your talks about being consciously curious, because I think curiosity is an absolute core of leadership. Curious about myself and insanely curious about others. And I think that curiosity, if you can, I've written a little leadership practice called the curiosity swap. So, when you will inevitably feel frustrated or annoyed or angry, there's energy there, right? And if you can train your brain to switch that energy into curiosity, then you will get better outcomes more often. And, these are, I've also, seen some stuff that you've said about, the neuroscience of this. And my position is that this innate curiosity that we have when we're born um, gets squished out of us. And so there's a concept called learning trauma that one of my mentors in the States talks and writes about. And I know that trauma is a strong word, and it's not about necessarily being humiliated by a teacher and then feeling some sort of trauma and maybe stopping learning. It's actually the education practices that start very early on in our lives and continue on through university and through, dare I say, leadership development programs that compel us to choose between right and wrong and compel us to memorize large amounts of information. Both of those practices and others bypass the brain's inbuilt system for learning, which is the dopamine opioid cycle, and squishes our curiosity. So, my research is all about sort of investigating that and how we can rebuild, re-engage leaders' brains to want to build the skills that are required for navigating VUCA conditions.
Yeah, 'cause there is a real paradox in this sort of space, right? Because one of the things that our brains really like, look, I think we like in general in society is we like certainty.
Yeah.
We find comfort in knowing what's going to happen. Many people find comfort in having a very tightly knit plan that's all going to come together. And also, when you see people speaking, about a topic, we tend to we look at the politicians who are polished and clear-minded and decisive and we sort of have this, I guess, framework that says good leaders create this level of certainty. But the paradox here is, in order to create the certainty, you sometimes have to feel the curiosity, and curiosity innately is an uncertain sort of practice. How do you sort of see that paradox playing out, and how do leaders grapple with that?
Well, one of the things that comes to mind as you say that is a concept called negative capability that was actually coined by a poet. Um, Keats, I think, and then taken up by people in system psychodynamics. And it's actually a practice, it's a leadership practice where I need to, and the opposite of negative capability is positive capability, which is about being right and being certain and making fast decisions. And we tend to get hooked on that in organizational life. That politician who sounds so certain that this is the truth and therefore the road we have to take is XYZ. Well, I think there's danger in that. And it's not about not being like that, but it's about not being like that all of the time. And in the face of hugely complex issues, I think as leaders, we need to practice deliberately and consciously sitting in the space of not knowing, being able to tolerate the ambiguity and saying to our teams, guess what, team? This is too complex. I think we need to pause here and be okay with not knowing what the solution is. That might mean we need to gather more data, or it could mean just consciously sitting in the space instead of gripping tight to a decision that needs to be made. And when you let go of that, my own experience with practicing this is that something emerges from the void of my not knowing that I couldn't have thought of had I not deliberately done this practice. So that's one point. I think the second point is about the uncertainty where it meets certainty and that kind of growth edge. So I don't want to be so uncertain that I'm paralyzed with fear, but I want to be a little bit uncertain because this next thing that I'm going to practice is just at my point, just at my growth edge, what one of my mentors calls the Goldilocks zone. Not too hot, not too cold, but just right. And the image I have in my head when I speak about this is, little 5-month babies who are desperate to get up and explore the world because they're just saturated with curiosity. And so they sit on their backsides and they start to rock. And they get that there's a little bit of height that they can get. And so they start to build the muscles in their quads. And they can, each time they do it, they just get a tiny, tinsy bit higher. And then one day they realize if they grab the leg of the chair, that gives them greater leverage and they have a huge growth spurt in terms of their cognitive stuff. And they leverage themselves up and they do it again and again and again and again. That is dopamine and opioid coursing through their little bodies. They keep doing it because that next tiny, tiny goal is just within reach. And it's beautiful to see. And that's what I want for leaders, to get excited about learning these new skills. And skills, for me, need to be broken. I don't think that you might have a magic wand, Dan, but I don't think we can say to leaders, go out and be more empathic. Go out and display empathy. That's a huge skill. And for me, those mega skills need to be broken down into their like the macro skills and then the mini skills and then the micro skills. Because when you can get to a micro skill, boom, that is something that you can practice in the moment, on the job, on the fly, just like that little baby, and see yourself getting better and better and almost feel your connectome, the neural connections in your brain starting to fire and grow. So that's what I get excited about. Not pushing people too far, not pushing them over the edge, but getting to their growth edge.
I think that's such an important point because when we're working with leaders and we're taking them from where they are and where they want to get to, it's sort of easy to say, well, here's what you have to do when you've got it all worked out. And those micro skills are important. I often I'm terrible at it, but I quite like playing golf. And I always think if I had a golf coach and they watched my swing and said, oh, well, yeah, you just need to do that better, then it would give me no useful sort of information. And what they would do is ask about, talk about where my hands are gripping the club and the angles and where my hips are and all those other things that I'm doing wrong. But I guess as leaders, part of that is not only what will I do, but how do I create that environment around me where that my people who maybe have grown up on or are so used to leaders who are certain and positive and have all the answers, despite them actually not, but they get so used to that trying to break that. And I don't know if you've seen this before. Some of the leaders I've worked with, I talk about putting on your Batman mask. You can't come back from a workshop or a coaching session and walk in with a Batman mask on. Everyone will think you're weird.
Yeah.
You've got to create the conditions where they can accept you're going to be a bit different. So how do you sort of help them
Yeah.
to do some of that?
Well, I think part of that is around authenticity. So, folks, I've just been on a 2-day thing, or I've just had an amazing session with my coach, and these are some of the things I'm going to start practicing. So you will see me behave differently, and it's going to feel awkward for me, and it might feel a bit awkward for you. And sometimes I might even tell you, so Dan, you've come into my office for a one-on-one. I'm going to really try to coach and only ask you questions and not make suggestions. And I give you permission to call me on my behavior when I go back into that old pattern of telling you what to do. And at the end, I'd like to get a bit of feedback about what I did well and what I could do differently next time.
Yeah.
I think that most people would respond reasonably well to that. What do you think?
I think you're right. They would and this is sort of it opens up another piece which goes along with the curiosity and uncertainty. I think, which is it takes vulnerability. It takes saying, "Hey, sometimes," and this is often an exercise I'll do with leaders, and anyone listening can do this. Take something you want to change and write out the sentences. Sometimes in the past, I have. What's that behavior? This isn't ideal because why is it a problem? And in the future, I commit to what will I do differently? And what's interesting in a workshop is often people will happily write these down, and then I'll tell them to say it out loud and they get terrified. And then I tell them to go back and tell someone in their workplace and they get really terrified because the vulnerability
Yes.
is hard. How do we help people step into the vulnerability more?
Oh, I mean, I think that's a beautiful activity. I'm going to re-listen to the podcast and write that down because I couldn't put it down
I'll
fast
send it
enough.
to you, Deb. I'll send it to you.
But I think, if we have to work from the premise that people are our most important asset, and therefore everything that you say about empathy, and by the way, I think that empathy sometimes has I don't know whether you would put this under the umbrella of empathy, but that tough love. If I really care for you as a human being, sometimes I have to have tough conversations, but I do it with empathy rather than sort of dictatorship. So if we hold the belief that people are our greatest asset, and therefore the toughest thing you do as a leader is to lead people, then connection with people is really important. And I wrote down many years ago, probably when Brene Brown was still in nappies, I wrote down a sentence in my journal that was something like, our ability to connect deeply with another human being is in direct proportion to our willingness to be vulnerable. And although that might fill me with terror, like an edge emotion, what I might then do is engage the curiosity swap and go, oh, isn't that interesting? I'm filled with terror at the thought of this. And I don't even have to say anything out loud. What might that be about? And what is the worst thing that could happen if I make myself a little bit vulnerable? So I think, again, vulnerability is a deliberate practice that, of course, we need to pick and choose the situations, but it's a deliberate practice. Let me just be a little bit vulnerable by rereading to you what I wrote in this workshop and see how it feels. And we'll be surprised. The world doesn't fall off its hinges. And in fact, we get greater levels of respect.
I think it's amazing, isn't it? Because there's a lot of talk about the imposter syndrome, but actually, I think the far more damaging thing that we do is we pretend to be perfect, or we hold ourselves to these perfect standards, or we try and just seem like we're perfect to everyone around us, and we forget that as humans, we don't really trust perfect. If someone comes to you and says, "I know all the answers, I've got all the words," we know most people go,
Are
"That's
you
not
in
true."
fact God? I think not.
Yeah, exactly. And so you saying it means I know you're lying to me now, and
Yeah,
trust
yeah,
is being diminished. Whereas when someone says, "Hey, I'm terrible at this, and I'd love your help," we don't run away and
yeah,
go, "Oh my God, they're terrible." We
exactly.
sort of get closer to them.
And we might even say, let's try and experiment with this new way of relating with each other and see how it goes. I think holding some of these practices in our heads as experiments is a good thing. And I just wanted to share with you a vignette, kind of an activity that I didn't see, but someone I know was in a very, very senior leadership development program, like a week-long intensive kind of thing, with some big names in that if I said them out loud, you would know who they were, right? And I think at about day 3, the hosting organisation brought in a psychologist and he did this activity. So he said, take a piece of paper and write down on the front of it how you show up to work. What do people see when you show up to work? And, decisive, articulate, intelligent, da, da, da. On the other side of that piece of paper, write down how you really feel. And then he got them to screw that piece of paper up and throw it to him. And he gathered them all up and threw the pieces of paper back to each person. And so they read out someone else's and they all read the reverse side. And it was I almost started to cry when I heard this, that these very, very senior leaders are overwhelmed, stressed, feeling like an imposter, even the blokes. Right. So we've got to just stop part of our job, I think, as consultants is to help leaders come to grips with reality. Because how people are showing up to work often is not how things really are.
Mm. No, that's right. And again, we take the easy road of let's avoid those challenges and just hope everything's going to be okay. And I think it's a bit like, if we had a machine that was breaking down or it wasn't working very well and we just built a workaround and we just pretended it was going to be okay, we know that that's not going to be a long-term solution.
Yeah.
And again, in our relationships and in our workings with other people, when we can't actually step forward and go, hey, look, I don't know what to do here, or I'm stuck here and I'd love your ideas, I'd love your thoughts. We do the same sort of thing. We don't create that long-term solution.
Yeah. And we might have leaders who sort of resist that, because there's not enough time. I mean, these kind of conversations you still have to have a one-on-one. Why don't we just not, instead of doing more and adding more to our to-do list, because we can't do that, we have to do things differently in the moment, on the job, on the fly. And that's why I'm really hooked into this notion of, micro skills, because when we can get to the micro skill, we can very quickly and easily build a learning practice around that I can do in my next meeting. And, I love what you said about golf, and what that reminded me of is that doco on David Beckham. And, he kicks the football like magic. But then we see him in the backyard as a little kid with his dad, and he's just practicing that same little bit of that incredible kick over and over and over again. So it looks like magic, but it's actually not. It's actually tiny skills and practice.
Yeah.
So, and the other thing that came to me was around, your team seeing you act differently. We can, once leaders understand some of this, we can make it a team activity. So in the service of empathy or collaborative capacity, in this huge, big skill that we know through research is absolutely necessary to get us through complexity, what we're going to do for the next week is ask good clarifying questions. Because asking good clarifying questions, once we know what they are, leads to clarifying your understanding of someone else's position, which is in the service of perspective seeking, which is in the service of being empathic. So we've got to work out how to break them down, and then we can work out how to practice them.
Yeah, it's a really good point. When we look at the empathy, I've actually built a process for empathy. And the reason I built the process is because I wasn't very good at it and I wanted to get better. And like you said, it's a big sort of topic, and you can get really, I guess, stuck in the academic literature and worried about all these different components and pieces. And I think it's about making it really practical for people. And as you said, when you're talking to someone, just really listen to what they're saying. When they say something, just shut up, both mentally and verbally, and actually just really listen. And it's amazing how rare that is in a workplace, in a team setting.
I think if all we did as leaders was get better at listening, because when you say that, just shut up and listen, even that involves many micro skills. I've had participants in workshops break that down. So what is it? What's good listening? It's eye contact. It's facial expression. It's noticing the words. It's noticing the tone. It's noticing the content. It's making listening noises. Like there's about 20 tiny, tiny behaviors.
Mm.
Because again, I don't think we can say to leaders, just go and listen, just spend the day listening, because they don't know how to listen.
Yeah.
As soon as someone takes their eyes off me when I'm speaking, the message my brain gets is that they're not listening, they're disinterested. And I know many leaders who really struggle just maintaining eye contact. It's a skill that we have to practice.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's one thing that I'm quite an auditory learner, so I like listening to audio books, and the eye contact isn't such a big thing for me. But again, as a leader, you've got to understand what does your audience want and need, and what's going to support them in the communication process. So it's such a fascinating space. I don't want to dive a bit into the strategy and strategic decision making as well, because this is an area where I sometimes get people saying, look, to make a strategic decision, it's about data. We just need data-driven decision making, and as long as I've got the right data, then we'll make a call. And it's almost uh, I've got a degree in maths, so apologies for this, Deb, but it's quite algorithmic, right?
Yeah,
It's there is
yeah.
a formula, there is a way of the world works, and we just put the data in, outspits the answer. And I want to contrast that with the VUCA world, because part of what I did in my study was nonlinear systems and chaos theory. And
Mm.
what that really says to us is no matter how good you think your algorithm is, the universe doesn't care about order, and it likes chaos a
Yeah.
lot more than you do.
Ah.
So, this algorithmic decision making can often go awry, and people play a big wild card. How do you help people, I guess, through that really complex process? This is a huge question. That complex process of strategic decision making.
Well, I'll answer it and then you have a go, and
Sure.
maybe together we'll come up with something. So I think the first thing I'd say is that there is more recent research around what makes for outstanding global leaders that talks about that leaders of today must have intuitive insight, and they must have a high order means of reflection. Now, those phrases were not in the leadership literature, not that long ago. And so when leaders talk about data-driven stuff, I'll say to them, if you're not paying attention to the emotional content of this, then you're potentially missing 50% of the data. Can you afford to do that? And we now know that emotion, the feelings and thinking are not separate parts of our brain. They are inextricably entwined. So people who say, I can put my emotions aside while I'm making this decision, I'm sorry, that's bullshit. Excuse me for swearing on your podcast. That's
Uh,
simply neurologically, neurobiologically untrue. So the data is there and we have to access it. And that means stepping into the discomfort of that whole big chunk of data. It's just as valid. And like any data, we collect it. We might also discard some of that data. So someone might feel strongly about a historical perspective that was relevant to the organisation 10 years ago. I still need to listen to them, acknowledge them, and respectfully say, that's true, that did happen, or that was the case, but we're here now. So that piece of data I'm not going to take into account. But this piece of data around how my customers might perceive this, or how people on the front line are going to deal with it, I need to hear the emotional stuff, because there's such a richness of data in that.
mm.
So ignore it at your peril.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And when I think about strategic empathy, I like that
Ah,
idea of
nice.
strategic empathy, which is what's the intangible information that you won't be able to put in a spreadsheet very easily, that you won't
Yes.
necessarily measure with any instrument. But what is that information that is going to be impactful in making a good decision? And I think if we think that data that fits in spreadsheets all that matters, then we probably wouldn't have the range of cars that we have. We wouldn't have $3,000 handbags. We wouldn't have all of this stuff that dominates our world, because humans don't make decisions on data alone. Most
No.
of them we use high levels of emotion. And again,
Absolutely.
I think that's a really good concept of ignoring it. I mean, when you said 50%, I thought sometimes a lot more.
Would
Some,
be. Yeah,
yeah.
that was being generous, right? But when I think about strategy, and you reminded me of this when you said the spreadsheet, and I say that someone says to me, "Can you come and do some strategic planning?" And I go, "Yeah, show me what you've got." Not all the time, but enough of the time I see a spreadsheet with some actions on it, like not a strategy. The top of my strategic planning pyramid, which kind of has this link to the heart, is organizational purpose and organizational values. And purpose is not about a vision statement, because leaders create the vision for the future. They say in 10 years' time, we want to look like this. Purpose already exists, and it's a concept that a lot of people don't understand. They conflate or mix up
Mm.
purpose and vision and mission. Purpose is why this entity exists, same as why you exist as a human being. Why does this entity exist? And the job is to reveal it. So, unlike vision, which is an act of creation, purpose is an act of revelation. And when you get there, it touches people deeply.
Yeah.
They feel it. And you might say, well, that's okay for a not-for-profit that does good for the children in Cambodia. I'll tell you a quick vignette, because it's one of my long-term clients, and they manufacture salt, right? They've got people out in the back blocks of Australia bagging salt, 8 hours a day. And their purpose is something like, we are entrusted to supply the world's most essential mineral that enhances people's lives every day. Now, it's the truth. And a test for a good purpose statement is, can you measure it? So you can't really measure that. You can't put a number on it. And that's when you know it's a good purpose. And when you can talk to the guys on the shop floor about why, as a leader, I'm barking on about wearing safety gloves and safety goggles, it's because, mate, we're entrusted to supply this. It's in the tomato sauce that you're putting on your fish and chips tonight, mate. So, contamination ruins our business. That's why I'm asking you to do it. So, that's the heart of a strategy. And then,
Mm.
of course, the values is how we deliver that and the way that we behave. So if people agree with me that must sit, that's your North Star against which you judge the data that's coming in. Is the data aligned with purpose and values? Yes, let's consider it. Is it not aligned? No. We're not going to make pepper, we're going to make salt. So it really helps with those big strategic decisions, having that as your North Star.
Look, I think that's a really good call out, because it's again, people want to believe in something, they want to buy into something, they want to feel it has some meaning, and we forget sometimes when we just turn into these robots that are turning the wheels over, that we lose that sense of passion. And this goes back to the point you made earlier around turning off your emotions. One, very much impossible. Of course, there are some people who don't experience certain types of emotions, but for the vast majority of people, if someone jumps out in a gorilla mask in front of you, you'll get scared. You can't turn that off. It's not an on-off switch. And you have emotional reactions when someone yells at you, or someone smiles at you, or someone says you did a great thing today, or you did a terrible thing. The other side of that, though, is if we think about what drives discretionary effort, and we think about what gets us out of bed in the morning, why do we, go the extra mile? Why will we make that extra phone call, or pick up that extra bag of salt even when we're tired and the
Yes.
clock's just about to tick over?
Yeah.
Because we care about it. And
Yep.
that comes from the same place, doesn't it?
And it's not only does that kind of, create a really lovely picture, it's strategically important because it gets results. There's hard, really solid research around organizations that endure over the long term. I mean, anyone can make money in the short term, just slash costs and put your prices up. It's pretty easy formula. But over the long term, if you want to endure over the long term, the differentiator between organizations that don't endure and the ones that do and are ridiculously profitable as a result are the ones that have unwavering alignment to purpose and values. And I was thinking about the senior leader who says, well, I can put my emotions aside. So if we're talking about the range of normal, so I'm not talking about, pathology where people have brain chemistry and brain connections that disallows them from feeling that emotion. But if we're talking about the range of normal, those emotions are there and they get buried alive. And icky things happen to emotions when they get buried alive because they'll find their way to worm themselves out and usually have unintended consequences and which are not pretty.
Yeah, one of the topics that one of the emotions that comes up a lot of the time in workshops I run is, and I talk about it unashamedly, is this sense of fairness. And if people feel like something's unfair, they've not been treated fairly, it's this very sort of deep and ancient emotion that sits within us.
Yes.
And just a little story that I was working with some school administrators, and we're talking about unfairness, and I sort of explained that, as adults, it's still there. It bubbles away, and we find a way to get our vengeance at some point. And they said, one of those ladies said, "Yep, there's a lady in our office who, when she does printing for this particular head of department that she doesn't like, he's done something to her or something. She'll just put a few pages upside down before she staples them together, just randomly." And again, it's easy to sit back logically and go, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's additional effort for no material benefit for this person. But again, this is that where you talked about this, the way emotions will seep in, they will bubble away. And even the most hardened sort of professionals, it will eventually eat us up.
Oh, I mean, that is such a that story just really got me in my heart because what must be going on for that woman that she will deliberately do that? Like it's quite extraordinary. I really feel for her because what she's going through must be awful to
Mm.
consciously and deliberately do that. And that reminds me of something that I wrote about when I did my master's, which was the concept of virtuous betrayal and leadership. So virtuous betrayal is not a sinister act on behalf of the leader. It's making a tough decision for a greater good or a higher order purpose that has your followers feeling betrayed. So let's say that woman was looking after a database or an IT system or something, and for the sake of, competitive advantage, we had to change the IT system. She may be saying, you know what? That IT system or that database or whatever was my baby for 5 years, and you're just ripping it out of my arms.
Mm.
If we don't listen to people and talk to people and understand people and display empathy, we can't heal that. And she will forever be turning pages upside down. It's like putting a banana peel in the manufacturing, wheels and spokes.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
again,
absolutely.
we don't pay attention to this at our peril, I think.
Yeah, and it's a topic I talk about a lot, Deb, which is, when you talked about it earlier, this idea of having tough conversations, tough love, I think was the term you used. But, when you've got someone in your team who is not meeting expectations, they're not doing the work, they're not keeping up and supporting the group to be successful in the way that we need them to, often people ignore them thinking they're being nice and caring and
Yeah.
empathetic. And
Yeah.
actually, they're doing that person damage and they're
Yes.
creating that sense of betrayal in the rest of the team who are sitting there going, this isn't fair. This is not okay.
Absolutely. I mean, empathy is not about affiliation. Affiliation, when you have a high need for affiliation, is where you treat everyone the same because you don't want to upset them when you've got a high performer here and a low performer here. I mean, what does that do to the high performer? They stop performing. Like, I'm busting my boiler and, my boss is treating me and everyone else the same. So that's, even though the intention of affiliation is to have positive, harmonious relationships, it actually comes back to bite you. Um, and I think, the other thing that I was saying before about purpose and values, I don't know how leaders lead without anchoring these performance discussions in the values of the organisation. So most of your performance issues are going to come from behavioural stuff, not whether they can manipulate an Excel spreadsheet. If they're underperforming because of that reason, the Excel spreadsheet, send them on a training course, get them to shadow Dan, who's outstanding at it. He's done a master's degree in mathematics, blah, blah, blah. It's usually the behavior stuff, withholding information, crossing your arms, rolling your eyes, blah, 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 blah. The list goes on and on and on. And unless you can anchor those conversations in the permission that the organisation has given you to say, these are the things that we are upholding as being important. And the thing that a lot of organisations don't do that kind of destroys that is they need to describe them behaviourally so that we know in this organisation, in empathic consulting, what integrity looks like, because that's very different in the mafia. Behaviourally, it looks very different in the mafia to being here with Dan Murray. So we have to describe it behaviourally, because then we give ourselves permission to say, "Hey, Dan, just came out of that meeting. Come and have a chat." So, Dan, something, I need to have an important conversation with you. What it's not about, Dan, is your project management skills and the way you do Excel spreadsheets. Like, it's just off the planet. What I do want to talk to you about is the way that you behaved in front of Trish and Tony when they were presenting their point of view. You interrupted, you rolled your eyes, you made dismissive noises. That's the behaviour that I want to talk to you about, because it's not acceptable around here.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote a book that's just down here somewhere on that whole piece around guiding principles, values. How do you turn them into those things that we can hold people accountable to, that we can use? And I think that's such a important point, that if you just reward results, people will find easy ways to get good results,
Yes.
but people will find bad ways to get good results, and you
Yeah.
perpetuate bad behavior. And so
Yes.
it's a story that we've seen through Royal Commissions. We've seen it through lots of different avenues, and it's such an important one, anchoring ourselves. And one thing, again, a little exercise, because I think this idea, this concept you've been talking about of breaking it down is really, really instructive. I often just get leaders to say, turn your values into statements that say, or that start with the words, "I will always,"
Oh,
or "I
nice.
will never."
Yes.
And as soon as you use those words, people get very weird and nervous and scared. But my view is, set the bar very high, know exactly what you're trying to say you're going to be, and then
Yes.
hold yourself accountable to either make it and get there, or to apologize and own it when you don't.
That's a beautiful way of getting the value into behavior, because I will and I will never has to follow something that we can see. The light is on or the light is off.
Mm.
And that's where the real gold is. And I mean, you can never be exhaustive over a value like, customer orientation or integrity or whatever. But you can get enough. It only takes probably 5 or 6 I will and 5 or 6 I will never to really give that value the richness in terms of what it looks like in this organisation. And the other great thing about that is that when you can take that kind of activity out a bit further to a wider population, you get the organisational kind of colloquialism and the organisational language to really make it come alive.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
And creating, what's the signature story? What's the
Yes.
way we've embedded that into our processes and systems? I think that's a
Yes.
really great place to take it. Deb,
Yeah, absolutely.
I suspect, Deb, we could speak for a long, long time. But in terms of the podcast, I would like to ask you a few of my empathy card questions just
Yes.
before we round out. And
Yay.
these are just random, sort of not random because I've written them down, but they're questions that we've put into a little deck of cards, and they're great for events, conferences, sometimes even those leadership teams where people think they know each other well. But here's your first one. What is something you are proud of but don't often talk about?
Hmm. Um, okay, well, I'm going to dive deep and be really vulnerable here with you.
Right.
So I'm really proud of the fact that I stopped drinking 8 years ago because I had a serious problem with alcohol. And it's not that I don't talk about it a lot. It's, I'm very open with it, but it doesn't come up when I'm running workshops on strategy often. And through that process, I'm also really proud of the people that I help with their own struggles with addiction, and to jog along beside people as they get well and transform. Like, it's bringing tears to my eyes. It's just divine.
Oh, that's wonderful, Deb, and congratulations as well.
Thank you.
What is something? Oh, sorry. What is your favorite or most impactful book you've read?
Oh, so the one that I'm going to have two. The one that immediately comes to mind, because we're talking about empathy, is an oldie but a goodie called The Road Less Travelled. And I read it probably 30 years ago. And from that day, I have remembered the sentence in it that is the definition of love. And I think it's the best definition I've ever heard. So let me run it past you. Love is the will to extend oneself for the purposes of one's own or another's spiritual growth. Every single phrase there packs a punch. The will, it's an intention. It's psychologically false to say, he made me love him. That's just rubbish. So it's the will to extend oneself. Love is work. I have to work at relationships. I have to be vulnerable. It's hard work having these icky conversations. So it's about the work to extend oneself. What's the purpose of it? It's to help each other become better versions of ourselves. And that reminds me, my beautiful 23-year-old daughter sent me a quote this morning. She's in a fairly new relationship and it's going super well. So this is the quote. I don't know who to source it to. It is a fine thing to have a relationship without moments of rupture, no doubt. But it is a finer and more noble achievement still to know how to patch things up repeatedly with those precious strands of emotional gold.
Lovely. That's so
Whoa.
good. Well, and it talks to the VUCA world, right? Is that best laid plans, we think it's going to work out a certain way. The world just doesn't care about your plans. The
Yeah.
universe has no interest in your, well plotted out life. And actually, it's our ability to rebond and reconnect together during those
Yeah.
fractures that is so important.
Yeah. And I won't say anything about the second book, just give you the title. Everyone should read it. It's only a tiny little book called Illusions, The Adventures of a Reluctant Messiah by the same guy who wrote Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Okay.
It's a beautiful, beautiful book.
Wonderful, wonderful. I always like to hear those little gems that I've not heard before. The final question, Deb, before I let you go, how do you define success?
Oh, what a great question. Um, I define success by living in alignment with my purpose. And, I'm not after happiness. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but for me, happiness is such a transient state. You have it 1 minute and the next day something awful happens and it's gone. Um, Success for me is finding that inner peace, quiet joy, that I can hold that line regardless of whether things are great or whether things are crappy. And I know that that's possible. And it's my life's work to get there so that I can be of the best service to others around me and be the best version of myself.
I love it. Thank you so much, Deb. It has been an absolute pleasure. I really hope we get to chat again. I think there's a lot we could talk about. So, but thank you for being on the podcast and look forward to catching up with you soon.
It's been a delight. Thanks, Dan.